Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Nina Power. Nina Power is a philosophess and an author of What Men Want and a senior editor at Compact magazine. She is a highly intellectual dame, and in this conversation, this is our second conversation, we spoke about a year ago about her book, What Men Want, and in this conversation, we talk about all things political and her various analytical tools for dissecting the world as it is and was and might one day be. We also get a little personal, and Nina opens up her heart just a little bit, and we get to see her inner workings. And in doing so, we talk about what it is to be Gen X, our strengths and our failures, and what we could probably be doing better to help the world as, ironic hipsters that my generation have always aspired to be. Great conversation. Not going to say anything else. Let's dive right in. Without further ado, here is Nina Power.
Oh, come on, this camera. Sorry.
Just really slowly put your hand and then slowly bring your hand back to where your face is.
I did that too fast. Okay.
There she is. Okay.
No sudden movements. I might have to do that a few times. Right.
So what are you doing at Compact?
So I'm like a senior editor, whatever that is. But I edit pieces, I commission pieces, I deal with people who have subscription problems. We do a weekly podcast, we do events, mostly in New York, and I don't know.
And where are you stationed?
So I'm in London.
Yeah, okay.
But the other three editors are in New York. You probably know some of them. You might know Jeff Schellenberger, his work. Yeah, he's great. And it was set up by Sohrab Ahmari and Matthew Schmitz. They're kind of Catholics. Well, they are Catholic. So it has a kind of Catholic element, but it's kind of economically left, socially conservative, I guess.
Yeah. Where are you in the Catholic, social left?
I am sort of half Anglican, I suppose. Like, I do go to church, but I'm not baptized, and I'm more on the pagan side of things. But sort of.
Like you have antlers that you wear on occasion.
Absolutely, very into nature, and and. No, but I mean, I think there's this kind of place where lots of people are politically homeless, right? So there's this kind of need or desire to have conversations with people you disagree with, which has been kind of verboten, and a lot of people are socially conservative and economically left, like they want redistribution, they want the rich to pay taxes, but they don't want like drag queens like grinding on their children. I mean, This is like a kind of normal position, which isn't really represented very well in the mainstream.
Why not?
Well, I think because the right, who might be socially conservative in some ways, are also liberals when it comes to the market. At least some of them. I mean, the kind of neoliberal. But I think, so we're in this kind of post-liberal space. Like, liberalism has failed because it succeeded. And what happens next? Do we need to bring back religion? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. All things I'm mapping out. What do you think you've mapped out over the last few months working with Compact and then in your own kind of explorations? Like, what do you like looking at? What's the most interesting kind of...
Well, I think it's this kind of precisely identifying this space, right? So through an analysis of how the land lies, right? Like, it's kind of... where are people at? I mean, it used to be on the left, I think, that you would meet people where they are, right? So you would talk to everybody and you would explain your position, and you'd say, this is our analysis of capitalism and this is why your life sucks. But I think, the left, as a so-called left, has become, extremely unwilling or unable to speak to people it disagrees with, and has become very insular and hermetic and judgmental. So I think there's a whole group of people who want to have conversations about serious issues like abortion, families, the future of their country, immigration, markets, etc., social and political and religious issues. with people who have different opinions. So I think it's looking back at kind of liberalism, which would include things like the sexual revolution, and asking questions, what does it mean 60 years later that we had the pill? What effect did this have?
Yeah.
What effect are dating apps having on young people? What about these kind of questions of technology and transhumanism and, and AI and all of these sorts of things? So, I mean, I think what we're doing is largely geopolitical analysis with some kind of social and cultural analysis, but we're trying to avoid directly engaging in the culture war in that kind of back and forth where it becomes a sort of reactive thing, if you see what I mean. Like, we're interested in like deeper analysis, right? So a lot of us are coming from theoretical backgrounds, like Jeff Schellenberger is very interested in Girard. I would say we all are, like René Girard. Sorry, this great French, well, no, not French, but great thinker of theology, anthropology, trying to understand things like rivalry, envy, and desire, and how these are, how these things are kind of constitutive of all social groups. And how, in a way, this leads to kind of problems of sacrifice and scapegoating, and how do we sort of come to terms with those tendencies? And
what came to mind last night, I think I woke up at like 4 or something like that. And I'm like, okay. I was anxious. I'm like, well, what am I going to talk to Nina about? And this question popped into my head that I've been thinking about, and it's kind of a triggering kind of even question. Like in Iran, there's all these protests about the hijab, and you see, the Westerners supporting this, like, liberate the women, liberate the women, liberate the women. And I understand our perspective on that, but there's a couple of questions that come up. One, do we think that our way of life is good for us, let alone the entire world? And secondly, if we trace back our own process of liberation, isn't that how we got to where we are now, where we can't even define a woman? And what's the through line between burning a bra and confusing your pronouns? Everybody's confusing their pronouns, right?
Sure. I mean, so there's a lot in your question, one of which is a sort of broader question about cultural relativism or cultural specificity, and the other of which is maybe the question of the relationship between feminism and progress and where we've ended up. I suppose they are related, of course. It's a very, very complicated thing, right? Let me start with the feminism question as I see it. It is our history. It's part of our history in the West that at certain moments women demanded particular kinds of rights, as did disenfranchised men. So we can talk about suffrage in the first wave and a desire for a certain kind of political representation as a form of equality based for when someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, the word feminism doesn't exist, but when she talks about things like moral capacity, she says, we both have it. Men and women are both moral agents, right? We wouldn't say if a woman committed a crime that she can't be held responsible, right? We might hold her slightly differently responsible, but we do think that women are adult human female, and they are moral creatures, right? In the same way that we think that men are moral creatures. So we're capable of virtue. Her kind of provocation off the back of the French Revolution and some of the ideas about equality, universality, and so on is to say, well, if we're all equal, if mankind is equal in some way, why are women being treated as unequal, right? What would it mean for women to have certain kind of equality? And I don't think this denies difference between men and women, but it says in particular areas, given that women have moral capacity, why not test them to see if they also have rational capacity? So her provocation or her test is to say, if you educated women, right, give women education, if they really are constitutively stupid, then they're going to mess it up, and then nothing will be lost. It will just have been an experiment. But as she kind of suggests, well, actually, no, women are also capable of reason. And therefore, they they should have political representation, as well as moral agency. So this is a provocation. It happens at a particular moment. It follows from revolutionary events in France that the kind of dissident people in Britain and elsewhere in the West are picking up on, and they're thinking, oh wow, what does it mean to talk about equality, universality, and fraternity? And can this brotherhood of man be extended to women? And this is obviously a debate that's happening in the late 18th century.
And I want to highlight that we don't think of them as dissidents because they won, right? So dissidents now are the reactionaries, but at that point in history, equality, liberty, fraternity were dissident ideas.
No, absolutely. And you have conservatives like Edmund Burke, most famously writing very strongly to say, look, be careful. This is what happens when you have a revolution. Things happen too quickly. Things get destroyed. It's too fast. You'll end up with the terror. And he was correct. Nevertheless, the Republic, in a way, settled into itself, right? And we have a general sort of acceptance in the West of the centrality of these kind of concepts politically and elsewhere. Like, what does it mean to be equal, right? And it's a very long-winded way of saying there are also kind of, there are political influences. There are also kind of market and economic shifts and technological shifts that basically bring women along, whether they like it or not. We can talk about agriculture, we can talk about the Industrial Revolution, we can talk about the conversion of women from, if you like, almost a natural feature of humanity to a workforce, right? Which is to say, so rather than tie women to their biological capacity, women become workers, right? This is also not necessarily in women or men's interest, but it is in the interest of capital. It is in the interest of industry. You can keep wages low if you have both men and women working. You don't, the family wage disappears. The idea that you need to pay the man in a typical family arrangement enough money so that his wife and children can live disappears. And then you have double income questions. You have questions of childcare. These are being discussed a lot at the moment, I guess, by the quote-unquote reactionary feminists like Mary Harrington, Louise Perry. And I'm close to them in some ways. I would say I'm sort of adjacent, if you like, that kind of language. So I think we have to look at it from a ideas perspective, like these ideas turn up. Are they a function or a consequence of economic or technological or historical shifts that would have happened anyway, right? You can talk about the relationship between Christianity and liberalism. Lots of people have argued that Christianity, because it also has a notion of universality and equality before God, that it has the precursor concepts for liberalism, even though we would now regard liberalism as largely secular or secular in practice. So there are big pictures and little pictures. I resist this idea that we can kind of blame feminism or blame civil rights or blame, the Pride movement for the situation we're in now. Like, I think there's a simplistic, slippery slope argument that a lot of people on the right in particular want to make, right? They want to say at a certain point, things go wrong and everything kind of goes downhill from there, right? Like it was, and we can blame feminists because they were the ones who started this, and everything's gone wrong. I think this is too simplistic. I think it also raises a question about if feminism is so powerful and it had this mighty effect on history, why on earth did the men let it happen? If men are sort of more in charge historically, why would they have let women or given women permission to have power, if you see what I mean, right? So you could equally say, well, it's men's fault that women had emancipation, right? And I think this is because we don't really think about power properly. We think about power as a form of kind of structure, as something kind of external, and a matter of scarcity, as opposed to thinking of all these different types of power. So women have always had power, right? We would never say that women don't have power over families, over men, this is one of the dangers of saying that women are always victims. Again, this puts women back closer to children that they need protecting, right? But women have loads of power. They have the power to refuse men. They have the power to upset men. They have the power. Yeah, it's a form of power. It's a real power, and it has huge effects. And there are different kinds of power: physical power, emotional power, linguistic power, the power to destroy someone's reputation, blah, blah, blah. So to go back to the cultural question about different countries, there is a question, right? Do all countries have to go through the same quote unquote progressive historical process in order to get to the end point? No, right? I think this is a terrible mistake. People were talking about this in the 2000s when they were, some people were pro-war, pro-bombing Iraq and other countries in the name of human rights, right? Do you remember this idea of like exporting human rights, exporting democracy, this kind of horrific idea? And that was based really on this idea that there is one way of doing things. It's, that all countries must progress through this sort of the same process in order to get to liberal democracy, right? Even though the West doesn't really have liberal democracy either, but this is the kind of fantasy. You can bomb countries into democracy. Absolutely not. I think that countries do have different ways of doing things. And that's good. There are different religious backgrounds. The issue, obviously, we live in a globalized world. There is no, in a way, getting away from the images and the desires and the products that exist in certain places and not in others, or that are made in some places and taken to others. So you have these deeper questions about desire and consumerism. And, there's no kind of pure culture left, if you see what I mean. There are no non-global or globally intertwined cultures. There might be a few tribes, who shoot arrows at the cameras. But, let's say that we are together in this global morass one way or another. And this is very, so the war becomes a war of images and a war of ideology and a war of what desire looks like. And I think we have to understand, so the desire is one way of talking about who we are, right? The way in which we're composed of desire.
Our aspirations, or
let's put it at a sort of deeper level. So in order to, if you like, even stay alive, we have a kind of fundamental drive to not only survive, let's say, to persist in our being, right? Spinoza will talk about this in terms of our conatus, right? We have a kind of inbuilt desire for self-preservation. But beyond that, we're not complete creatures. We are constantly lacking, right? We're hungry is an obvious example, right? We eat and then we're full and then we're hungry again. We feel that we want things that we don't have, whether that's romantically or materially or, I don't know. We want to achieve things for ourselves. This goes back to your point, but it's bigger than achievement, right? It's a kind of, it's motivation, right? We're incomplete subjects, right? This is what psychoanalysis tells us, that we don't know ourselves completely either. We are motivated by things that are sometimes obscure to us. It doesn't mean we can't make decisions about how to live and how to, which habits we ought to acquire, right? There are clearly better and worse ways of living, and we've probably all experimented with those and worked out, maybe I shouldn't do this thing repeatedly because it's ruining my life. Maybe I should lose some weight. Maybe I should eat this, So we have some degree of control.
But when it comes to just the image of the hijab burning, the Westerner, probably more likely the Western woman, projects her own desire for liberation onto that. And in that projection, it just could be the case that some questions are lost, or just assumptions are being projected too that are not really examined.
Yeah, again, this is historically really vital. By the way, the bra burnings wasn't true. That was a kind of made up story. It did
Really?
then happen. Yeah, yeah. But it
Nobody
wasn't
burned their bra?
originally. No, it was something that was written in a newspaper article as a kind of joke, but then some women actually did it, but it didn't come from the feminists, and I think in the first place at least. Although sometimes it is very nice to take your bra off. I don't know if you get really high, you don't want to wear a bra. It's great, but or when you go to sleep and so on. But yeah, what is the bra? I mean, it's very you could do a whole hour on the bra.
It was invented by a man. It's kind of like an extension of the
Yeah.
patriarchy, right?
I mean, but yeah,
After a
potentially. I
fashion.
mean, why do women need to wear a bra? I mean, for goodness sake, Anyway, whatever.
Let it all hang out.
But,
Yeah.
but I suppose so in Iran, I actually was fortunate to visit Iran a few times in the 2000s, and the recent history of Iran, all of these movements in Iran over the past few years have to be understood in the context of the 79 revolution, and then also in the context of what was happening with the Anglo-Iranian oil company and the kind of British, if you like, colonization of Iran and the resistance to Britain in particular, but the West in general. Iran was forcibly westernized under the Shah. I mean, men were forced to wear hats, and there was a kind of massive, very rapid, enforced westernization at the level of dress and so on in Iran, which is, again, you do think you impose things too quickly or things happen too quickly and there will be a backlash.
Yeah.
So, in 79, you have this uprising. You then have the Iran-Iraq war immediately. So Iran is put on a war footing. The Muslim aspect of the revolution imprisons the communists and the left-wing people, like the Tudeh people in the Tudeh party. Many of them are killed, right? 6 months later, in the, as the war kicks off, right? The Iran-Iraq war, 80 to 88, is the longest war in the 20th century, and you have Iran is this very proud and rightly protective country of its resources, which it has, immense resources. A very beautiful country, extremely a mind-blowing place, actually, in many ways. It's obviously Shia. Persians and Iranians are not Arabs, famously. They very, very specific things to their culture, which really make them very unique and a very historical country. And how to put it, so whatever's happening in Iran, you have the theocracy, you have the theocratic takeover. It's partly because Iran was on a war footing, and that there was no, I don't know, moment for Iran to have a slower nationalism, I think. This is just my interpretation, by the way. I'm sure lots of people would disagree with, and it's much more complicated. But there have been lots of protests in the last 10 years or so, longer, against the repressive aspects of the regime. There are very well-educated middle-class people in Tehran, in North Tehran, many of whom have traveled the world and speak many languages and, extremely educated and cosmopolitan middle class. You also have a lot of poor people who are very religious in practice as well, who are very committed to Shiism. And, I wouldn't want to say exactly what all of the causes are of the current moment. I think we have to listen to what people are saying in the country and not impose our own interpretation, our own values. If the women are asking for help, if they want support and recognition, then we should listen to that. But I don't think we should be too hasty, as you say, to read into what's happening there, something that we know is the better way of doing things, right? Yeah. Imposing a vision of liberal values or so-called democratic values.
Yeah.
It's not for us to do that,
Well, I think our ethos as liberals or post-liberals, and I think everybody in America, everybody in the West is liberal, whether they want to be or not.
Yeah,
It's just the water that we swim in.
exactly.
One thing that we react very strongly against is repression and authority and authoritarianism, but also authority. And at least Americans are so knee-jerky about it that we will call anybody a fascist that intrudes upon us or pressures us to behave a certain way. But without some amount of repression of desire, instinct, and self-motivation or selfishness, we're in a war of wills, right? It's all against all. It's all power, naked, brutish power. So we need some sort of recognition of authority. And in the conversations that I've been having with the right wing, you kind of hear, one thing that I hear a lot in the right wing discourse is this desire for authority and this critique of the world that we live in currently in the West as lacking authority, lacking respect for authority. And I don't know how we go back to respecting authority. I don't know how we go back to, people jump to, should we impose religion or not? But it's deeper even than just having a system of belief. It's having a willingness to be ruled, right? And to participate in society in some way, shape, or form that is conformist to certain values and ideas. And I don't know how we impose those values. And then the left, kind of under the aegis of liberation from all forms of oppression, becomes increasingly more oppressive and increasing more judgmental because they also are acting out their desire for everybody to obey their flag or whatever it is, right? Or their ethos. So I don't know if that is particularly a salient underpinning of our personal culture war. And then using these satellite states to cheer along the freedom from different forms of repression is kind of something, again, that might be our problem ourselves, like our constant revolution that we're constantly in, or constant progress that we're constantly imposing upon ourselves, regardless of the consequences or the problems that come up in response to taking those fences down.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't defend authority for its own sake. I mean, I think we're all... Even as a Londoner, even as a servant of the crown. Well, I think if we're talking about sovereignty and tradition, there might be something slightly different. But authority, is a bit too close to autocracy or fascism. It's like I mean, maybe some people want a new Führer or a new Caesar, but I think. People are much more interested in the common good. I think we have different interests, right? Like mothers have different interests than single women. Working class men have different interests than capitalists. I don't know. We live in a democratically pluralist world. And the problem is forcing everyone into a straitjacket and saying you must all believe this, right? People do have different interests. I mean, we see this in the conflict of rights that is currently being played out over the trans stuff and women's rights. Yeah. At the very least, whatever you want to say about it, it's an obvious conflict of rights, right? So if we take that as our starting point, that politics is basically a form of disagreement. We constantly disagree. We have different rights, different interests, and that basically what we have to try and do is come together and make people the least sad, right? It doesn't mean that we're going to make anyone happy, but we try to negotiate ideally. This is why we need to speak to each other. This is why we need to have dialogue. This is why we shouldn't cut off people, even people we think have radically unpleasant views. I'm not a total free speech absolutist in the sense that I think defamation is, should be dealt with. But, up until you get to the point about lying about named individuals, I think we need to talk about things that concern us, right? All of these difficult things, all of these difficult ideas. There has to be dialogue. There has to be discussion. There has to be negotiation. And if any group of people start saying, you can't criticize us, we're off limits because we're ultimate victims, or we're a sacred caste or whatever, you have to be extremely wary, right? Because this is where people become tyrannical and they become sociopathic and antisocial by virtue of saying that they're somehow exempt from democratic discussion. Right. So I think if there is an order, I think there is an order in the universe. I think there's an order in the way that we do things. I think we have particular kinds of bodies. I think that men and women exist and they're real and they're different. I think that there are better and worse ways of living, shockingly. There are better and worse things to do to one's body. I think in the first place, one of the most important things is to try to look after oneself, as difficult as that is, to establish order in one's own life, right? That's hard enough, let alone thinking about governance and, I think that we should be extremely wary of institutions. I'm very Illichian. I'm a fan of Ivan Illich. Sorry,
Okay.
This great sort of renegade Catholic thinker who's fundamentally very critical of institutions, because in a way, institutions, as he says, always turn into their opposite. So things that start off like medicine. Medicine is about health. Medicine ends up creating patients because it can make money out of them. It can keep treating people if they're sick, right? Ideally, we would only want to be treated for something that we couldn't solve ourselves, right? Medicine and intervention should be extremely minimal. We've seen gross incursions into the Hippocratic Oath and the idea that you shouldn't remove healthy flesh, that you shouldn't tamper with healthy bodies, whether we're talking about a mental illness or physical illness. What we're seeing is an encroaching medicalization and intervention into all aspects of human life, including things like grief, depression, sadness, and these all become pathologized and financialized and medicalized. And Illich sees this happening in the early 70s. He writes a book called Medical Nemesis. This book became extremely relevant again in the recent COVID era, where you saw this immediate rush for medicalization, for these political lockdowns, which had no precedent and no basis in, the existing protocols. Right, it was extremely dubious politically. Even people who agreed with this at the time or went along with it and chastised other people are now having to walk that back, I would say. I'm also a big fan of Giorgio Agamben, a very brilliant Italian philosopher, and he was one of the few people really to speak out very early on and repeatedly, polemically against the biopolitical state and saying, what on earth are we doing? Why are the states locking down? This is an absolute travesty, really, of human life, of social life. You're telling people they can't see other people and so on. On what basis is this happening, right?
Yeah.
And I think what we saw was, as we often see, is governance by fear. Fear is a very powerful, deep motivating factor. Lots of people don't speak out about things that they know aren't true and aren't real because they don't want to lose their jobs, because they have families, because they are rightly afraid of losing what they have, because they have responsibilities for other people. There are very few people who are able, therefore, to stand up and say, hang on, what's going on here is completely wrong, and then pay the price for it.
Yeah.
Which we've seen a lot in different areas. But I would say particularly over COVID and particularly over the discussion around gender, there have been multiple forms of punishment and mobbing and cancellation and so on.
Yeah.
There are other issues for which this is true. But, it does take courage to say, I don't agree with this. Something is going wrong.
Can you, this is kind of science fiction-y, but can you imagine a global world that doesn't have coagulating forms of power, institutions, just where people's desires kind of merge and coalesce into these authoritarian bodies up and down? Like, is there any way for humanity to live at the scale that we live in with the connectivity that we now are reliant on without so-called institutions? How do you minimalize the institution on?
Sure.
Because institutions developed or adapted human collectivity at scale. So how do you scale without that crap?
Yeah, really complicated because we do need some institutions, right? It's a very radical position to say we need to demolish all the institutions, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, some people want to live off grid and live their own lives and not be connected and so on. But this is not a scalable position, right? However great it might be to sort of grow your own food and live in nowhere and not be online. You could go down the sort of Ted Kaczynski route without the bombings, without the
Yeah.
parcel bombs. Uh, I suppose, yeah, what I suggested is a kind of suspicion of institutions, right? So at least in the first place, whenever you have a body that says, oh, this is the reality now, or this is how we're going to do things, you need people to say, hang on a minute, is that really a good idea? Is this based in reality? Does this negatively affect children? I think your discussion with John Euler, I'm not sure how you pronounce his surname, the other day, Euler, it was very interesting. It was very kind of long and sort of meandering conversation in many ways. But I think he really touched on this kind of problem, which liberal institutions don't have a good way of dealing with, which is the infiltration of institutions by extremely negatively motivated individuals.
Yeah, or people who, in the very least, lack the capacity to care or basic empathy.
Yeah, I mean, whether we accept Euler's... Euler's idea that it's a process of decision, and he's very Christian. He presents in a very kind of it's a question of free will. It's so some people, I don't know why, but let's say some people take it upon themselves to eliminate their own conscience, right, as he suggested, and they become more and more utilitarian, more and more selfish, more and more antisocial, because everything is simply motivated by what they want to do, regardless of how whether it hurts other people. But then in the end, it becomes even a matter of sadism, like the enjoyment of depriving other people of their life or their innocence or whatever, right? So he presented it as a sort of process.
Yeah.
I don't know about this. I don't work on psychopathy.
Yeah, you can take it or leave that theory, but him pointing out, and I'm glad that the discussion with him went in the direction of, well, why are these types of people promoted by our institutions now? Why are they the leaders of our institution? And I guess what you're angling at maybe is that one way to be suspicious of institutions is to be aware that they are breeding ground for people who are pure chess players, pure game theorists.
Yes. Right. And I think, a lot of people who want to do, let's say, antisocial things are highly motivated. Right. So, and often that makes them attractive to institutions because someone rocks up and says, right, I'm going to do all the work. I'm going to, and people are like, oh, cool. Great. This person seems into it or enthusiastic, whatever. Oh, this guy is volunteering to, do all this stuff. And it's very difficult because I think we have a general theory of mind of the other, which is that we trust other people. Let's say not completely and not immediately. We might try to be a little bit like, oh, hi, who are you? What are you into? A friend says, oh, this guy's okay. You can trust him. We still talk in terms of like someone being a man of their word, or, we have these sorts of folk ways of understanding each other that basically broadly for most people involve a degree of almost like background trust, because we have to live in a world in which we do to some extent trust that other people are fundamentally good.
I can riff on that by saying in America, when the idea of Black victimhood is really turned up, at least at the Evergreen State College, and then during the George Floyd riots, there was this myth that a Black person couldn't step outside of their home without getting assaulted directly, immediately by a police officer, right? So when you start to think of yourself as always in a completely, purely untrustable world, a bunch of neuroses. It's not psychologically healthy. So on a certain level, it's probably just healthier to assume the best, or at least assume some sort of generally positive goodwill toward other people and from other people, just to function happily, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we implicitly do. Like, if we buy a product, right, we generally assume that it's not going to poison us, right?
Yeah.
We have faith to some degree in health and safety and in, those kind of institutions, right? Without which you could have all kinds of exploitation and I mean, The Third Man is a film about what happens when there are no restrictions on things and that you have these kind of unpalatable figures who make money off of selling poison to children,
Yeah.
this is right. So we do need certain institutions, we do need certain regulations, right? But how to put it, if we lived in a totally suspicious world, like you're suggesting, it is a neurosis, right? And this kind of fear was encouraged during lockdown. Like in the UK, they actually had a unit that existed to encourage fear in the population. It was literally like a fear promotion unit.
What was it called? And what branch of government? What do you mean, a unit?
It was part of the government. It was literally called something like the Ministry for Promoting Fear. And later on, they were all like, yeah, that was a bit unethical, but we felt like we had to do it because we wanted people to stay in their homes. So they radically overplayed in adverts and things the risk of COVID and put lots of moral pressure on people.
Yeah.
The whole "you're going to kill grandma" stuff, and they really over-egged it. And a lot of people who are already, let's say, worried about their health or hypochondriac or neurotic, took on this fear for months, for years.
Well,
there are
this
still
day.
people,
Yeah.
right? And this is unhealthy for them mentally, right? It's unhealthy for anybody, and it's a direct consequence of that kind of fear mongering, because fear is very, very powerful politically. And if you govern by fear, you can get people to do things, but it won't last, right? It's much better to govern by consent and in a democratically pluralist way, rather than get people to do things because they're worried that you're going to kill them if you don't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that level of fear just generates ultimately resentment and resistance and the possibility for revolution.
Yeah. 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 Without a release valve somehow coming along to extinguish or express that fear. And that's why in one reading of 2020, those protests erupted a couple months after lockdown, and were even encouraged by the same people who were fear-mongering, right? It's okay to march in the street because racism is a bigger threat than this novel coronavirus. But it allowed at least the youth specifically to release some of the pressure of being bottled up, of being controlled, and then they could, the powers that be were really clever in a way to redirect all of that anger at like this nefarious problem of racism rather than their own policies, right? Even though I think that it was all feeding into itself. And then at the other end of that, what you see is that the powers that be take all of that popular will to end racism, and then they staff themselves with these huge bureaucratic jobs or bureaucratic people that go around and police other people's speech, police other people's thoughts. So the institution benefits the entire way through. And I don't see how you stop that. Because the people that end up in those positions of power were selected by the system to promote the system. They're agents of the system, whether they're knowing it or not.
Yes, for sure. And I think on the one hand you have anarcho-tyranny, which is this idea that basically states governed by a combination of alternate anarchy and alternate tyranny, right? So you let cities burn, it is a release valve, and then you kind of shut people in their houses, and you just kind of confuse people basically by oscillating. But you're right that there is a kind of bureaucratic or admin mind that is conformist, that is encouraged by and rewarded by institutions. We see this. I mean, I was in academia for 13 years. It was obvious that
really?
Yeah.
Of all places, academia would act like this? Like, why would academia, this bunch of smart people, you'd think that they'd be clever enough to...
But what was being rewarded was precisely this kind of admin mind, right? So if you were an academic and your research wasn't going very well, you could sort of become part of the administration and, head the department and, you know, maybe shut it down or get rid of staff, help management. Like basically you end up working for management.
Yeah.
At the same time, you have the expansion of HR, like this kind of make work jobs, like these pie chart manipulators, these people who are like, you know, oh, you can't use these words. You know, you must have training to understand that your fellow man is, you know, I don't know, this and that. And you're like, but we already know how to treat each other, right? Like,
Yeah.
Anyway,
well,
you know, and these
why,
kind of
in your experience for 13 years in academia, which is the seat of this this kind of bureaucratization or this virus of bureaucracy, how did you resist that? And at what level did you become wary of it? And is that, you think, part of your personality or your previous experience or something that you learned along the way? Like, why would you not get all the rewards that were offered to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a very Gen X person, and I think in the 90s when I went into academia, it was really fun. I mean, I was at Warwick, which was a wacky place. I was there just after the kind of absolutely apex derangement that was occurring under Nick Land and Sadie Plant and the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit. And Warwick was a crazy place in the 90s. It was very
Warwick?
Warwick is in the Midlands. It's in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's not. That's fair. It's not fair. It's between Coventry and Leamington.
Okay.
It was just a very strange university. It happened to in the 90s to attract. They had a conference called Virtual Futures where lots of people would come and take drugs and talk about, you know, the coming internet thing and whatnot. It was very crazy place, and there were lots of very, very interesting people there. And I was very I don't know, blown away by the people I met and the conversations we had, and just the possibility of having intellectual, wacky discussions with people like 4 a.m. About Spinoza and I don't know, computers.
Can I ask a kind of personal question? Like, what was your aesthetic as a college girl, like that time?
My aesthetic? Wow. I actually completely indifferent. Like I wore sort of men's clothes, quote unquote, until I was 23. So I just wore like, you know, I was sort of grunt. Yeah. I was quite grungy, cool. To be honest. I really had this kind of, it wasn't such a pressured thing because it wasn't so imagistic, the whole culture. It was much more about like your character and your interests and your personality. Yeah. And of course you can be nostalgic. Of course there are things wrong with it. The 90s was too hedonistic. It set up lots of people for addiction and other. Gen X has huge problems with suicide and you know all this stuff. And but at the same time, it was great. In, you know, like nobody ever said to me, oh, you wear men's clothes and your interests are quite masculine. Do you think you're a man? Like nobody said that to me.
Yeah. They're more interested in your ideas than your identity.
Right. Or they thought I was an idiot or whatever. But like, at least it was on the basis of like who I was, right? Like in terms of my interests and speech, not what I looked like. So I guess I had that sort of indifference to my appearance at that time because I was much more interested in intellectual matters.
Yeah.
So I just would have.
I'm sorry to get personal, but because we're on the topic, what happened at 23? Where did you just like discover your femininity, like some sort of like Nina's got her groove back kind of thing going on? Like,
I know I had my groove before. In fact, if anything, I was cooler before. I think because I was then in like a kind of long-term 10-year sort of, well, ultimately 10-year relationship with a guy. So I don't know. And I moved to London maybe, and I got very into like vintage clothes and this kind of
like vintage, thing. Like Victorian, or are we talking about like the 60s?
I was kind of quite into like things that were quite constructivist, like the Sovietish sort of design, like quite space age, like primary colors and angles, geometrical dresses and stuff.
Okay.
So.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. But it was like a bit silly. Like I do regard clothes as like dressing up. It's like a kind of silliness, right? You shouldn't take it too seriously. Like it's just funny. Like it's funny to make people laugh or like go, oh, that's a weird outfit. You know, it's a bit more like amateur dramatics or something.
Okay. Were you a theater kid at all? Or you're the bookish sort?
No, but I think I'm definitely histrionic. Like I have this tendency, for sure, that I think became more and more prominent as I became older. Like
Yeah.
there is a performance desire to sort of perform.
Okay, well, I think that that's important. I think that that might fill in a little bit of why you would not want to be bureaucratized. There's some
I mean,
sort
it's
of
just boring. Like apart from anything else, like I got
irony.
into
Yeah,
philosophy, yeah, because it was fun. It was so interesting, and I just was like, oh my God, great! I could read all these books and have these conversations, and that can be my life, you know.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I was like, wow, this is amazing, you know. And then it just sort of became not increasingly not like that, not just for me, but for everyone, you know. Like all these institutions became market oriented. They became businesses. You know, we lost the fee vote, so students ended up borrowing like 50K. I was very involved in trying to keep university education free, like in 2010. And, you know, we lost, and the universities just became more like businesses. And of course, they became like every other institution. They were literally bringing in people from industry to become like the vice chancellors. So as opposed to academics, people who had cultural, poetic, you know, literary, scientific backgrounds, they were just bringing in these kind of awful
MBAs,
management types.
Yeah,
yeah, and their only job was to shut down departments and save money.
yeah.
You know, and it just became really unfun. And like, there are some people who like meetings, and you're like, why would you like meetings? so like at the end, I just basically couldn't go to any meetings. And if I went to meetings, I was just sort of sitting there going like, this is like, why? You know, and it's very bad. So yeah, I deinstitutionalized myself, but I think it was always there because of the 90s, I guess.
It was more a matter of taste than a positive taste toward fun rather than a negative reaction to authority, perhaps, or maybe a mixture of the two, or
maybe a mixture. I mean, I think Gen X, because we had some security compared to millennials, and I spent a lot of time talking to my co-hosts on the LAC, who are Helen Rollins and Benjamin Studebaker, who are millennials, and we talk about generational difference a lot. And you know, I think they're correct in saying that actually it's millennials who desire structure because their lives are so precarious and so lacking in security, any notion of the future, any ability to buy a house and have a family. For many people, you know, many millennials don't have enough money to do that. They're very, very worried about their future. I think as Gen X, we had residual benefit from boomers. Like, you know, I owned my flat, I had free education. You know, we were the last cohort to have those benefits that our parents also had to some degree. So we have a piece of the pie, not as much as the boomers. You can look at it, it's all statistical at this point, you know, the wealth division.
But we had more wiggle room and
yes,
more of an assumption of optimistic future. You know, if you go back to the 90s, part of the nostalgia of the 90s is looking forward.
Yeah, I mean, it was the end of history, but it was also the possibility for doing loads of things, and everything was up for grabs, I think. But everything was mockable. Our humor was different. Yeah. Like there was nobody off limits. You know, this is the era of kind of South Park and I don't know, very extreme. You know, I don't know, Vice, the original Vice. Yeah. Like everything was kind of like a target, like in a nice way. Like this is how we're going to get along, right? We're gonna undermine each other in an ironic and gentle and kind way, but it's going to be kind of harsh, you know. Yeah. And this is another form of equality that we've lost actually, or a kind of democratic playfulness, I would say, that actually helps things get along. You know, once you're able to make a joke about somebody, then you're able to be their friend, you know. Yeah.
One negative aspect, I think, of Gen X and how we failed millennials, I'm going to opine, is that we took the institutions for granted, and the more creative, free-spirited among us treat ourselves as above politics in a way. And so it kind of blindsided us in the last 10 years because the people who were left over were responding to a need of more order and more, market restrictions.
I think that's fair.
So we're kind of playing catch up. We're like, we're kind of the boomers. Like, why are you guys taking everything so seriously? You know, but we're kind of coming with this apathetic, ironic attitude that we have to kind of compromise a little bit to get things done, right? While still giving, like when we enter the culture war not taking drag queen story hour as the end of civilization, right? Kind of coming in with a wink and a nod and using ridicule to shape or reshape discourse. Right.
No, I think that's fair. I think we economically benefited, and this allowed us to be creative and playful, but it didn't really give us much motivation to think about, our own contribution to politics. I think that's right. I mean, we didn't, we don't have great Gen X politicians, really. I abnegated our responsibility at the end of history, I think, by almost like, I don't know, like the ironic distance is definitely part of it. The emphasis on kind of creativity and doing your own thing means that you're not really a team player necessarily.
Or let alone a statesman, so-called.
No.
Right.
No. And this did allow institutions to become something other. Like, I guess when in the 90s, I probably just thought, oh, they just exist.
Yeah,
and
they run themselves,
Yeah. Like,
why would I go to these meetings? Yeah.
Right. And like, who cares? Like, screw the man.
Yeah.
Like, I've got things to do.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, there could be a silver lining in that our generation, generally speaking, are particularly keen to facilitate the formation of alternative experiments and institutions, right? We might have the wit, the creativity, the outsiderness that can help people who are not being served or who are being increasingly dehumanized by the force of these institutions creating alternative magazines, podcasts. No?
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I'm just thinking about like who is successful. I mean, actually, a lot of tech people are Gen X. I mean, I would say Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are both Gen X. And we live in their world. I mean, we live in Bill Gates's world, obviously, but a lot of Gen X did go quite hard on the tech, the internet side of things. And I'm not sure like Facebook world was the greatest thing our generation. I mean, like grunge and Facebook. Oh, well done. Fantastic. Good work. So I don't know, but our legacy, we did create new institutions and new ways of doing things. But I mean, pretty much everything new is bad. Like, this is a problem. Like, we should probably not do very much. I think we did have an inclination towards a sort of Zen nihilism. Like, if you leave before you start doing anything, then you're not even playing the game, right? You're like, like the whole reality bites, or like, I'm not gonna get a job. Like, I'm not gonna like be part of the system. Like, why would you do that? Like, this is stupid. But then of course it means that other people like are the system, and then you have to live in their world. Politics,
it doesn't matter if you're not interested in politics. Politics is interested in you, kind of thing.
Or Facebook is interested in you, or like the internet is interested in you.
Are you deeply read in the Nick Land oeuvre? I
mean, to some degree. Like I said, I was at Warwick. I was very young in 90, I was 18 in 97 compared to the people who were there, who are much older, who are already, PhD students. And Nick Land left after my first year, and I never met him in person, but he was very influential on the Warwick.
Like, I really understand him. Like, I try to listen. I'm trying to familiarize myself with him. Yarvin's more my frequency, but I know that they're kind of a binary dark enlightenment kind of progenitors.
But I think at that time in the 90s, right, you had a lot of people who were working on Nietzsche and Deleuze and, again, like questions of desire, questions of analysis of politics. It was a very materialist approach. I mean, Nick Land's first book is on Bataille. It's a very strange and interesting book. It's in the wake of the death of God. You had lots of people who were trying to formulate new kinds of materialism, I guess, that would help them to understand, let's say, these deeper currents that exist, and whether it's through psychoanalysis, this question of desire or will or power, or these sort of forces that underlie civilization and culture, and all of these sort of grandiose, and morality, and all of these sort of like top-down narratives about how great we are and what progress is. So there was a kind of darkness, a sort of deep kind of genealogical attempt post Nietzsche.
Yeah.
People were reading a lot of Deleuze and Foucault. They were criticizing Oedipality, so the family. They were criticizing kind of structural ideas of normativity, right? So there was a lot of norm breaking, a lot of interest in transgression, hence the interest in Bataille, a lot of interest in hedonism, like at the level of sex and drugs and forms of behavior that were like,
Short-sighted.
transgressive.
Yeah.
Transgressive according to the norms, like of the 50s or something, right? Not
Well, and
particularly
the
transgressive.
religious right in America was pretty strong in the 90s too, so that was a force
Right,
to resist. Yeah.
exactly, and that's in a way why the left was very pro free speech, freedom of expression, artistic work. That we thought the conservatives were like, I don't know.
Stodgy, backwards,
Yeah,
boring.
like they were the ones censoring things and burning things and banning things,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah.
left was against that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we were interested in transgression. So Nick Land at that point wasn't the person he is now in the sense of his interests in, well, crypto was not a thing, human biodiversity or some of the things that the intellectual dark web are interested in. But the precursor, if you like, were there in the form of a kind of radical critique of everything.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
okay. Yeah.
A desire to abolish or transgress norms of all kinds, whether it be structures, institutions.
What was the goal of that? I mean, I was there at that time doing the same thing. I had my own goals, but I'm just wondering, if you strip all normativity off the world, like, what are you looking for? Or do you think that there'll be a free fall or some sort of miraculous emergence of something realer, truer, better, bigger, more real?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe it was partly about trying to find deeper energies and to locate these sorts of flows. I mean, it sort of unleash the flows was a very Warwick phrase, like unleash the flows of desire, see where they
Okay.
may lead.
I hope there were condoms around, because that sounds really messy. At least hazmat suits a little bit. There's a lot of bodily fluids going around, just releasing all the flows. I'm sorry to go there, but
No, but I think that you actually have this in Deleuze, right? They quote Henry Miller, and he says, "I love everything that flows, even menstrual blood." And women are like, "Oh my God, you even like menstrual blood? Thanks, it's really kind." But this, this idea that one is like an adventurer or an
Yes.
experimenter.
Yes.
Like the one experiments with one's own limits.
yes.
To find extreme experiences. I mean, perhaps it's this idea of experience.
Yes.
And it's a post existentialist thing. It's not quite existentialist, but it's after existentialism. And I think it is this idea, almost like the William Blake idea of, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom,
Yes.
or, an embrace of extreme modes of behavior or extreme states will tell you something that breaks you out of the norm, or breaks you out of structures.
Yeah.
And this is very Foucauldian as well, right? People were reading Foucault, Deleuze, Bataille. They were also trying to link it to kind of new forms of materialism, evolutionary biology as well. Like lots of people were trying to plug these things together.
Yeah.
Like, how do we have a scientific, philosophical materialism that is also experiential and
What do you mean by
extreme?
materialism, just for sake of definition?
Yeah, I suppose, if you like, at its base, it would be to start with matter, right? So rather than to assume the existence of a transcendent God, creator, rather to deal with the world as it is. Like Bataille will talk about base materialism. Obviously, you have historical materialism in Marxism, which is, also anti-religious. It's to say, look, let's look at the real processes, right? What are the real forces operating in the world? How do we get rid of idealism? How do we get rid of transcendence? That the idea or the fantasy that everything tends towards the good, and actually look at the kind of horror and the base reality, whether that's matter in the sense of nature, non-human nature. Schopenhauer points out that, like, nature is very violent. I mean, we know it is, right? When you look at, he talks about the the lion killing the gazelle, and the delights of the violent animal, and and that in a way we are subject to these forces, right? This will, this desire, that in a way we can't transcend our own nature, which is in some ways very base, right? And civilization, as Freud points out after Nietzsche, is the process of sublimating our baser desires, right? It has to be. We have to repress. There has to be strategic repression for anything to get done.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we just sort of lie around like, I don't know, masturbating and eating and killing or whatever. I mean, I don't believe this to be true, actually, but at least this is there's an aspect of all of us which is
Athens could
animal.
only support one Diogenes at a time, right?
Right. And I think a lot of people thought of themselves as Diogenes. Maybe this is what happened.
Strategic repression. Yeah. Did you just come up with that? That's a good one.
Yeah, it's quite good. I think it's a way of understanding what we all had to do, right? Like, there are things I would like to do, but I can't and I shouldn't. It's better for everyone that I don't. Same goes for everybody, right?
I like the idea of stripping. You were talking about stripping the transcendental, but stripping the not the supernatural, but the what's it called, superstitious, from analysis. And one thing that is a tendency for us to do as public intellectuals or people who are trying to make sense of the world is to assume conspiracy, is to trying to strip away that. I don't know if materialism. I would call myself materialism. I have a deep-seated resistance to that term because I'm not a materialist. But when I try to analyze what is happening, why is it wrong? Why is it bad? Is it inevitable? How do we change things? How do we fix things? Right? How do we resist? Living in pods and eating bugs if we want to go in that direction, and trying to do that with the least amount of conspiracy mindset, while still allowing for the fact that there are very powerful people who are all in it to get away with as much as possible. When the WEF, comes out, we need to restrict people's thoughts, and we need to get the human population down to 70 million or something like, or 5 million or whatever like that. You're like, wait, that's kind of genocidal. There's got to be conspiracy there somewhere. Or like the COVID thing, like why are we now throwing out the Nuremberg Code? Like what's going on with that, and trying to, so I guess when you look at this stuff, I assume that you bring multiple kind of analytical tools to it. What are kind of some of the romantic things that you have to kind of push down in yourself in order to have a clearer head when trying to communicate what's going on in these very complex domains?
Yeah, I mean, I think, conspiracies are real. A conspiracy is literally just a group of people deciding to do something, right? So I think, conspiracy theory is often used to dismiss legitimate questions. I mean, many people had very legitimate questions around COVID, and many of them were proved to be correct. Many people did say that the elites engaged in various forms of blackmail and paedophilia. Epstein proved this to be correct. It's one thing to be suspicious. It's another thing to be kind of paranoid. Paranoia is a pathological state. I think paranoia can be a useful analytic tool. Like sometimes I don't like smoking weed, but sometimes I will remind myself like once a year of what it is to be paranoid, and then like think about things from that state. Like it's a kind of way of seeing the world. So I think it can be very useful, but you wouldn't want to get stuck there. But you wouldn't want to get stuck in various pathological moods either, like anxiety, fear. So I see these as like prisms for seeing the world. Yes. Like different moods are and the more you can kind of bear in mind at once, the greater strength you have. This is what Nietzsche says, right? It's the capacity to bear multiple truths at once, right? Nietzsche is not against truth. He's against the reduction of truths to one truth, right? This is what he says, that basically, the capacity to see the same thing from different perspectives is, if you like, the expansion of knowledge. It's the expansion of our own power, right? We can look at a tree and see it as a home for birds. We can see it as wood. We can see it as a beautiful object. We can see it poetically, scientifically. So there are all these different ways of seeing things, right? The same thing. I think we do have to pay very great attention to what people with power say that they're doing, what they want to do, and what they actually do. You don't need a whole lot of other baggage, right? Like Occam's razor, like the simplest story is usually the correct one. To understand that people have very different ideas about what the world is and their place in it, and some people do have a lot more power than others
Yeah.
to make decisions. And so I would basically, this is why I wouldn't restrict speech. I'm against censorship. I'm against all of what we saw, the shutting down, whether socially or actually, like the Twitter files did reveal things. They weren't, it's not just nothing. You get like the FBI saying we need to close down, Groiper Princess 72, who's got like 3 followers because this person is like questioning the lockdowns. And you're like, oh my God, right? So they actually really do care, it seems.
Yeah.
Right? This is not, it's not it's not wrong to be strategically paranoid. Maybe this is all about strategy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's very obvious that certain ideas are not palatable at particular moments to people who are in power.
Yeah.
And look at the push towards transgenderism and transhumanism. I mean, these are real forces. They're financial, they're political, they're personal. These are institutions have been captured. There is a lot of pushback, right? But it is a war. It is a battle over the meaning of words, right? Politics is also a battle over the meaning of concepts. This is what philosophy is about, really. It's about analyzing concepts and saying, well, what do we mean by justice? What do we mean by war? What do we mean by woman? What do we mean by truth?
Does it ever go the other way from kind of the liberation of definition or the encroachment of certain transgressive ideas? Does society ever revert? I guess you did mention that there will be a blowback, but what do you foresee? Like with the transgender stuff, there's people who, I know a lot of people who are wrestling with it and trying to fight against the, at the very least, allowing a child to mature before you hook them up to medication for the rest of their life.
Yeah,
for
God's sake.
In the very least, right?
Yeah, I mean, come on.
Yeah. But that's the progressive idea. Like, does it ever go back, and how does it go back? Do we ever retain that? Does that genie, ever go back in the bottle? Does Pandora's box ever,
Yeah, but I think we have to acknowledge that we're in a war. We don't know. We're in this war at the moment.
Yeah.
Right? I can't tell you what the outcome of this, battle will be, right? But I think that, and maybe because I choose to be optimistic, right? I don't know if I'm fundamentally an optimistic person, but I choose repeatedly to be optimistic, right? Because I have that capacity to decide my outlook in general, right? Yeah. You can do this. It's very interesting. If you just repeatedly decide to be in a certain mood. Sartre says this. Sartre says you can choose your moods, right? We're not just subject to external forces. This is what nihilists want you to think, actually, that you are not capable of taking yourself in hand, right? And this is part of my break with the left as it became, right? Not the left I knew, but the left became just this kind of guilt field, like this incredibly nihilistic death cult. Like everything became, but people are dying, and you must feel guilty for having a job or like having any kind of privilege, so-called, which isn't what privilege means. And it became absolutely stultifying. Like you can't even fix yourself if somebody's telling you have reason to be depressed, right? Because the world is shit and capitalism is evil and, yes, drink yourself to death, right? Because that's how things are, right?
Or
it's very
burn down a bridge and break.
Right. It's sort of destructive, right? It's destructive of individuals, of groups, and of the world. It's a kind of it became this anyway. It became a kind of violent alienation or a kind of active nihilism in many ways, as Nietzsche talks about. The active and passive nihilism, and I think so. And this wasn't the constructive left. This wasn't the socialist, kind, compassionate left that talked to everyone and was like, men with beards drinking real ale in pubs and, saying, oh, we should, redistribute the wealth, right? And we need to think about class. That was not that. It was something else. It was like a death cult. Yeah. And, it was like defending mutilating children and whatnot, and in the name of progress, and you're like, what the, no, like this is not healthy, like at some basic level. This is awful and even evil, to be honest. And I think, yeah.
So your first line of resistance to nihilism is optimism. It begins with you. The first line of resistance to the ills of society begin with you. That's where you...
I think the contemporary left is very resistant to thinking about the individual and the individual's capacity to make improvements in their own life, which is why the field has been left wide open for self-help on the so-called right. I don't think, for example, Jordan Peterson is right-wing. I think he's a kind of Jungian Christian person, whatever. He's not particularly right-wing. He quasi-Christian, whatever he is. It's very basic, what he's saying. But the field has been left wide open, right, for men in particular to come along and say quite rightly to other men, the way you're living is unhealthy. You can take steps not only to improve your chances of getting a girlfriend, but also just to improve your life, right? To become less a passive vector of forces and more just somebody who looks after themselves and takes responsibility for themselves. It's so basic,
who
right?
is significant in their own right.
Yeah, to themselves, apart from anything else, right? And it's obvious that there is a communal aspect or a consequence of this. Is like, if you look after yourself, you are better able to look after other people, right? So there is a social or even socialist aspect to taking care of yourself, as difficult as it is, right? I'm not saying that it's easy. It's a struggle for everybody to look after themselves, right? It's really hard, right? Life is suffering. Life is full of disappointments and, awful things. And you have to be grateful for what you have, right? This is another thing that the contemporary left can't do, is be grateful, because everything is bad. Everything is structurally awful, Yeah. And so, Christianity has lots of great concepts. Even if you're not Christian, it has forgiveness, gratitude, atonement. Someone else has died for your sins. You're a bit sinful, but it's okay. That means you can't judge other people completely because you yourself are also broken. It's good. It really worked, and as a social technology. And we're in this post-Christian age where we've reverted back to very Manichaean idea of good and bad. There are good and bad people. And I want to be a good person because everybody wants to be a good person. So if I just say the right things and I don't do anything wrong and I walk around in fear with loads of guilt, right? Maybe I'll be good. Maybe people will think I'm good. And look, there are these bad people. They have the wrong ideas. We're allowed to hate them, right? We can take out our own sadness and frustration on these people because they're bad, right? These women think that men can't become women and that children should be protected. We can hate them. You're allowed to hate them. Have
you seen anybody that you know personally revert from that mindset? That was really in that mindset and then woke up or changed? I don't want. You
mean in which direction, as it were?
In the direction toward gratitude and away from envy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have. I think this is a really common thing that's happened, actually. I think a lot of people have realized that to be in nihilism is untenable. I think a lot of people get to use the pill metaphor. I mean, there are no pills, but there are pills, but you shouldn't take too many pills, especially bad ones. But anyway, I mean, I have my supplements here. I have a sort of, I don't know, broccoli seed.
Broccoli?
It's
like these spicy system. Eyes or something?
No, it's just like a vegetable thing. It's fine anyway. But anyway, but people can be like nature pill. They suddenly go oh my god, look at the world, look at nature. It's incredible, right? Yeah. Or they can be like white pilled, the optimism thing, or God pilled, or I don't know. People have encounters or experiences, I think, that wake them up to the fact that their life does have meaning, and that there is a world. And that there are other people in it, and it's great. Or there's a lot to be interested in. There's a lot to be moved by. There's a lot to admire and love, as well as all the bad things. It's everything is mixed. We published this piece in Compact by Gambin about the Benedict, the former Pope who resigned. Yeah. And Gambin made this very interesting point about the resignation in 2013, that This was a critique of institutions. This was Benedict saying that every institution is riven by both good and evil. This is to go back to this point, it's a fundamental question or an issue that we all have, like we're all good and bad. Therefore, institutions are good and bad, right? That they exacerbate tendencies because institutions are us, right? They seem to become something else.
Yeah.
Because we reify them, but they really are people.
I don't know. I'm thinking about this, and I don't want to misspeak, but there's this well-spoken atheist in California named Sam Harris. He was part of the New Atheist movement, and a few months ago, he was interviewed by people who have interviewed you and me, and that I've interviewed on my show. I don't know if you've interviewed Constantine and Francis, but he was on trigonometry, and he came out with this really weird kind of string of thoughts about President Trump. And there's a lot of analysis or a lot of blowback that he got, but it seemed like he had such an existential faith in the institutions, and Trump was an existential threat to these institutions. Like I opined, and it's probably wrong, and I got pushback on this, that it was the state is his religion. Like his faith is put in the process in these institutions. And I have a hard time thinking in that way, so I can't really get my head around why he would believe so strongly in that and still be an atheist too. So there's a lot of contradictions.
But that's why he's an atheist, because there's nothing outside this world, right? So he has to believe in institutions because institutions are the limits of his world. Right. This was revealed, I think, in the lockdowns.
Okay.
Basically, the state for people who are not religious, who don't have any sense of spiritual, it doesn't have to be Christian. It just can be any other way of thinking about the world. So actually, to go back to the materialism point, what you actually have is a kind of institution-based materialism, which means that people have to put their faith in these things because they have nothing else. Right. So Agamben made this point about the contemporary Pope. He said, why isn't the Pope going to visit people by their bedside? Right. If the Pope believes in God, if the Pope is part of a spiritual world, a different world, a world that is not the biopolitical regime, is not the state. Right. Why is he adhering to these earthly rules? It's a very good question. Right. And I think for those people who have worked themselves into this position where there is only the state, there is only institutions, they have to believe in them, because to not believe in them is to experience a form of, like, I don't know, depression and loss and nihilism that they can't really countenance. You know, what would it mean to think that institutions are not working in your best interest? It's pretty bleak, right? You have to go through it. This process of suspicion and mistrust is uncomfortable. It is very hard. This is why a lot of people don't want to do it. They have suspicions that things aren't right, or that there are questions that need to be asked, or that certain people are pushing agendas that are actually maybe not great, that are maybe causing harm, but they don't really want to think about it, because to think is very painful at the best of times. And then to stand up to things that are going on, that people are saying, no, this is great, this is progress, this is what we want, you know, is even harder.
Yeah.
So then it comes out in these outbursts, like these hateful outbursts. Like, you're allowed to hate Trump. You're allowed to hate TERFs. You're allowed to hate blah, blah, blah. White men. You're allowed to hate incels. You know, you're allowed, like the liberal media, you know, it always works like this. You're allowed to hate certain groups, but you have to revere other groups.
Yeah.
You know?
Why that group thinking? Why is that baked into so-called the prevalent media, the mainstream, the liberal media? Like, why is that group thinking there?
It's a very easy way of controlling people. It's a form of just divide and conquer. You know, if you make people into enemies.
Could it not also be the byproduct of believing in the state? Because the state, the bureaucracy, treats people as either units or as groups. It seems like in order to believe in the state, you have to take on how the state believes in you, right? So group, demographic.
Right. So, I mean, Alain Badiou, this philosopher I worked on a lot a long time ago, he points out that from the standpoint of the state, like everything is countable. Like we live in the era, like completely of like numbers,
Quantity, yeah.
right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, like Gwenon talks about the reign of quantity. Everything is measurable. Like, we're data, right? Like go online and like, everything's harvesting your data, blah, 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 right? So we live in this, quantitative way, but this doesn't exhaust who we are, right? As split beings, as mixtures of ambivalence, of so on. We're ultimately
Hunger,
poetic
yeah.
as well. Yeah, like we're lacking. Sometimes we're hungry. Sometimes we want to write a poem. Sometimes at the same time. So how to put it? So yes, from the standpoint of the state, you can be counted, right? But this doesn't exhaust your capacity or your potentiality or your character or who you are. And I think the problem with state taking on the thinking of a state is that you have to believe that you are the state somehow, that the state is you,
Yeah.
and that
I and my
if the
father are
state,
one. Yeah.
yeah, that there's no rivet, there's no gap,
Yeah.
which is why people went to bat for the COVID rules, why they became police, and I think we see this, it's a deep tendency in authoritarian regimes, and we need to learn the lessons of history. We need to look at the Stasi. We need to look at states where policing was encouraged and people spontaneously took it upon themselves to report their neighbors, usually over questions of envy.
Yeah.
It wasn't political. It was just an opportunity to punish people for like being loud or having sex or enjoying themselves or whatever. And
This is a hard circle to square for some people, people who are atheists and who have thought themselves through atheism and are very rational, nice people, nothing wrong with them at all, but they are atheists. But in the case of what we were talking about with regard to Sam Harris and believing in the state, if you take a strictly material world, you end up believing in process and state. It seems like embedded in the word atheism is this post-belief kind of human, this human that doesn't need to believe in anything greater, higher, or more. And that doesn't seem possible to me, that people are believing mechanisms. Why do you, if you agree with that, why do you think that is? And how do we foster that, or how do we relate to our belief?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. There was a sort of series of tweets from Charles Murray recently, in which he basically said, I don't know if you saw them, but he basically said, "Look, I've been a scientist, a scientific man for decades, and I now have come to the conclusion that we human beings can't live without some form of religion." Right? Quite interesting move, right? Like, I think. That I remember that whole new atheist stuff. It was crazy. I mean, it was extremely anti-Islam. It was very pro-war. It was kind of an awful moment. Like people running around calling themselves bright because they were more intelligent because they didn't believe in God.
Today I am euphoric.
Yeah. No, it was. There was some like weird, crazy moment where it's like, those little rubber bands that people used to put around their wrists.
They had rubber bands too. They had like little.
Yeah,
it was like rosaries of atheism or something.
Yeah, it was like this kind of crazy moment of like, like we've eliminated all superstition. We're going to have a theory of everything. And
then 2 years later, they spawned the social justice cult. Right?
Maybe I haven't traced the causation of that, but sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think human beings are. I'm very interested in the question of when we become human, right? I'm very interested in prehistory and prehistoric monuments and Stonehenge and Avebury, and this is sort of the joke about being pagan. It's right. So the question of when we become human, but let's say if we use this word, I mean, as Illich says after Barbara Duden, there are no human beings. There are only men and women, which is a very interesting point. There is no human, if you think about it, but nevertheless. We are constituted by ritual. We have a relationship to our own finitude. We are aware of the fact that we are limited beings. We clearly have a capacity for repeated behaviors, for spiritual recognition or experience, for narrative, a desire for transcendence, for art, for beauty. And these are all, there's a war on all of these things, by the way. All of these desires and all of these capacities.
Yeah,
right?
because without those capacities, we're much easier to control.
Yes, exactly. And if you get people to stop thinking that they have a poetic dimension or a spiritual dimension, then then people, you can convince them to go along with things, and they will be in a state of nihilism where they passively watch or occasionally actively burn down something in a city, but basically spend most of the time just consuming and not opposing the plans of other people. Again, this is not a conspiracy, right? There are many market interests. There are financial. If you want to just trace the money, this is important to do. I mean, people are doing this work tracing the money behind transgender medicine or behind reproductive technologies, right? They're clearly vested interests. It's easy for us to understand that some people just want money.
Yeah.
Right. We know that. Yeah. It is a form of sociopathic behavior, but is rewarded in a particular system.
Yeah.
I don't think most people want money. That's not the thing that most people care about. If you ask people what they care about their family and their friends and where they live.
Yeah.
And these are good things.
Yeah. One of my counters, and it's still kind of half-baked, and I like it half-baked because half-baked things are gooey and sometimes taste good and sometimes make you sick. But one counter to the gender identity ideology is returning to some rudimentary, kind of lighthearted, not worship, but honor of man and woman as categories, like a gender positivity, like the masculine and the feminine, the man and the woman are seats of divinity or are seats of creativity and have a very powerful ability when they come together and harmonize to create wonderful human beings. Not only create human beings bodily, but create wonderful human beings through the love and the respect and the balance between those two things. And so I'm not gender critical because I think that gender as a ideal or an aspiration is very useful to give men and women insight into themselves, into each other, and then into possible ways of blending and coming into harmony with each other. And I know that part of your interest, part of your work has been on masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, the book "What Do Men Want" is really about a book about the relationship between men and women, and it's a positive book, right? It's an optimistic book. It's a book that says actually men and women get along, and they have lovely times, and it's playful, and this idea.
Where did that come from you? What if that book, divorcing it from the message, what it would mean to other people? What was that a dialogue between you and yourself, you and
me
love?
And reality?
You and reality. What do you mean by reality? Like biological?
My experience,
hormones,
my experience of the world, right? So this whole idea that men were toxic and ontologically evil, which is it's just a very bad recapitulation of a stereotype of radical feminism from the 70s, which never really existed. But then liberal feminism somehow became permission to hate men as a group. And my father is a very good man, my brother is a good man, my male friends are very good, my partner is very good, like it just isn't true. It's not to say that there aren't men who do bad things, and men are at the extremes of the bell curve in every respect.
So why do you love men then to such an extent that you would write a book honoring them? Like where does that in you, in your heart? Oh, huh.
Because men are different. But because we have various forms of compatibility, which are extremely pleasurable and interesting, and I'm not talking fundamentally about sex, because I think sex is another form of control. It's a dominant mechanism that's very easy to exploit. I'm more interested in conversations, and dialogue. It's not to say that sex isn't important. Of course it is.
Wait, are you talking about sexuality, really, sex, or biological gametes?
Sex as in
transaction.
The
between,
act.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Right. So we live in a culture that's dominated by the idea of sex as something desirable and all encompassing. Yeah. It's not that important, right? It's important if you want to have a family, right? But it's encouraged. It's another form of manipulation. Pornography is a form of manipulation. I'm very anti-porn for the reasons that it destroys fantasy. It destroys our imagination. We have enough material in our own heads or in our dreams, to think about each other in a much more playful way. we don't need these, these images are themselves horrible. They're generated in horrible ways, and they generate horrible feelings in people who watch it. They generate shame. Men who often overuse porn end up in shame states. They can't interact with the world because they're in this cloud of shame. It's another form of control. I do actually believe all the conspiracies around porn, actually.
What conspiracies are those?
That porn is a deliberate mechanism designed to control people's desire and libido and to steer them into particular states of being that turn them away from being kind of social and good people. I think pornography is extremely powerful. Images are very, very powerful. It doesn't mean we should censor them, but it means that we should understand their power. We shouldn't be blasé or nihilistic about images and think, oh, we can take it. Oh, it doesn't matter. They're just not real. Yeah. Right? Most of the time they are real and they have real effects. Yeah. And you can create forms of numbing and shame through the repetitive use. And we know that pornography for a lot of people is progressive, as in people need like harder and harder pornography to, John Euler was talking about pornography to some extent, right? It's a very dangerous force. So leaving aside the kind of negative aspect, what I'm interested in is the positive playfulness, the lightheartedness that's possible between men and women. And I think the otherness of men and women, I do think it's cosmic. I think it's like amazing, our infinite differences. And I have lots of male friends who I have fantastic conversations with. And
so you write a book about what men want, and I'm sure there's an assumption that men want women. So that leads to the question, like, what does a woman do to be good to men? Like, or the other side of the coin, and it's men need to be good for women and women need to be good for men. What did you discover, or what have you learned over the course of your life about being a woman to men, and I guess evoking the positive otherness and releasing the energies through the heterosexual discourse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously the title of the book is a joke. It's a joke about Freud, because Freud famously says, "What does woman want?" And he can't answer it. So I was like, I'm going to reverse Freud's title. But anyway, I do ask men in the book. I ask my friends, and some of them say pussy, some of them say beer, some of them say a shed. One of them says to be a good man, whatever. Like, it's jokey, it's like playful in that sense. But I think fundamentally, before we are good to each other, we have to be good to ourselves and good for ourselves, right? And this is very difficult in a sort of godless world that doesn't really value virtue. So to even discover the capacity to be better, to be slightly better, right? This is all you can do, I think. But this is very optimistic, actually. It's like, rather than being... Lots of people have perfectionism issues, like, oh, if I'm not perfect, if I haven't got this job, then everything is screwed, right? This is a nihilistic position, right? What you can do is very minimal, but you can do it. You can slightly improve yourself.
Yeah.
Right? That's all you can do. But you have to do that in the first place, right? It's not fair to burden other people with your crap, right? It's not to say you can't deal with your crap through help from your friends and family. Sometimes people need that. Like, I've had various crises in my life, very serious ones, and health-wise, otherwise, addiction-wise. It's, everybody suffers, full stop. So sometimes people suffer more than others. Sometimes people are in very great health or mental health issues. Sometimes they never get out of them, right? We try to help people we care about and love, and sometimes the way we do that is not by sorry, my camera, is not by letting them carrying on doing it. Sometimes we have to be really tough with people. Yeah. It's very difficult to do this, to intervene, actually, because the person will hate you for doing it if you're trying to get someone to stop.
And it might not even stick, right? Without
exactly.
Their consent.
It's very risky, actually. But anyway, I think ultimately a lot of people get to the point where they're like, oh, I need to deal with my own stuff one way or another. Right? Yeah. However you work out how to do it. And it's usually quite similar things. It's usually, don't do the thing that makes me addicted and makes me a dick. Don't eat the food that makes me feel like crap. Try to eat as healthy as you can. Drink water, go to sleep. It's really basic, but this is true. Like, we have these particular bodies. Part of the fantasy of this consumerist, individualistic society is that we don't have any limits and that we can do whatever we want to ourselves because we want to do it. But we don't, we have strict limits,
Yeah.
right? Our bodies are not infinitely malleable. They become very unhealthy if we do unhealthy things to them. This is just a fact. It's inescapable. We're not separate from our bodies, so it's stuff like that. We are our bodies, and it's very basic. But that's why I mean that space has been taken over by people who make a lot of money off of saying very basic things.
Yeah.
And it's fair enough.
Yeah.
You need someone to do it. And it should be your parents, it should be your church, it should be your community ensuring that everyone's okay. But it's hard to do that when everyone is atomized and individualized. Anyway, sorry, I forgot your question. It was something different, actually. But
well, you brought up my conversation with John Euler being long and meandering, and here we are.
I know,
again.
oh dear.
Yeah. I don't want to take up your whole evening because I'm sure you have a club to go to pretty soon or something.
Maybe a game of Civ 5. No, I have to do some work for the magazine. But I do love Civ 5.
Oh, really? Civ 5, not 6. Civ 5.
Civ 5, come on, man.
Okay, all right. I tried 6 and I'm like, I already spent 200 hours in 5. I don't need to do 6 again.
Only 200 hours. It's nothing.
There's probably a lot more. I don't know. Elden Ring really ate up a ton of 2022. I'll tell you that much. That game really hurt me.
I think computer games should be rationed. They should be, occasional. Like most things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, everything in moderation, including moderation. Some people aren't spiritual because they haven't had spiritual experience, and some people are spiritual even though they haven't had a spiritual experience. What about you? Like, why is there a reality to that to you, if you don't mind?
I don't know. I think a whole series of things. I think, maybe encountering some very wacky ideas. I used to suffer from insomnia terribly as a child, so
really?
I spent a lot of time. Yeah, it was awful. And
why your mind was just running?
I don't know. It was just like that for years, and so I'd spend a lot of time just in these very strange and extreme states, and often in these like twilight states, I guess. And then I had very like extreme repeated experiences with drink and I don't know, politics and mental health, and I don't know, like philosophy itself is very extreme, right? Like you entertain a lot of very wacky ideas.
Yeah.
If you get really into philosophy, and you get better at it, you get more and more interested in thinking through unthinkable things potentially. Yeah. Not to destroy them, but really often to protect them, to protect concepts or to clarify concepts. Yeah. It's not a destructive discipline.
Philosophy with a hammer kind of thing.
It's actually a tuning fork.
Yeah. Oh,
everybody gets it's the translation is wrong. Nietzsche doesn't philosophize with a hammer. It's a tuning fork.
What?
So he takes the
I blew up my entire life in my as a 21-year-old because of mistranslation. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Gosh.
No, seriously. I was taught this. I went to work and we had this great teacher, Martin Warner, and he said, look, you've got to understand it's not a hammer, it's a tuning fork. So Nietzsche is talking about diagnosing, right? Taking the pitch of the era, right? Nietzsche diagnoses nihilism. He's not a nihilist.
Yeah.
This is very important. It's like to analyze something is not to defend it or to criticize it necessarily. It's like to take the measure, like ding. Yeah. What does our age sound like?
Yeah.
It's not a hammer. That's.
But with all these things, you mentioned drink and thoughts and insomnia, but and the other question is, you have all these different lenses. There's got to be a core to you, or there's got to be a relationship that you've had to tend with your core in order to not be a whack job or completely dissociated, completely like some bug-eyed, like everything's a million different views and angles. Or are you just, you are the panopticon? Like you?
No, no, of course not. I don't know though. I would say I probably have had a lot of very extreme experiences that I myself have put myself through, and some I haven't, I guess, and not more than other people necessarily. But I've also structured my life in such a way that I don't have many responsibilities, even though I think responsibilities are very good. I just don't think they're for everybody. So I know, and I think it's also responsible sometimes to realize that you're not the kind of person who should take on certain responsibilities. Like I'm banned from driving. There are loads of things I shouldn't do. Right?
Even
like,
self-driving cars. You don't have a Tesla or like some sort of weird.
No, we didn't.
Motorbike
it wasn't like that in the 90s. I don't know. Anyway, but like some people, and it's okay, right? Like some people shouldn't have certain responsibilities, and it's better. And it's always been like this, that there are some men and women who don't have families and don't have children, and that's okay. Like whether they're monks or nuns, or when they're not forced into it, obviously. Compelling people to not have children is bad, but this is a very complicated question to solve socially, and I don't think the state should be giving people wives or whatever. This is not going to solve the problem.
Is that a thing? That's a right-wing male fantasy, isn't it?
Yeah. Some people want this, the state wife or whatever. But anyway, no. So, but how to put it? I suppose I am interested in the kind of foundations that follow from extreme thoughts or thinking about what it is that reality is composed of, and whether that's in dialogue with friends or through various altered states. I return to things anew, I suppose. I think my core is fundamentally me at 15 or something like that. It's 15-year-old me. I feel like I haven't really aged in certain respects.
You peaked and plateaued at 15.
I sort of became who I became who I am or was and still am at 15 somehow. It's hard to explain.
I can see it.
I'm stuck there in some ways.
One day you'll wake up, you'll be a 85-year-old wise woman, but you'll have skipped the intervening 70 years somehow.
We are all of our different ages. Like, it's very interesting. If you get very high and you look at your friend, you can see them at like 7 different ages. It's really cool.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I see boy you and old man you, and
Yeah. No, I work with kids and I see the adult in the kid, and then when I hang out with adults, I see the kid and the adult. You can see that if you look.
Yeah, it's cool.
So evidently you consume content. You've mentioned that you've listened at least to one of my shows, but what do you do when you're listening to podcasts? What is your activity while you're consuming?
Well, actually, I mean, podcasts are a bit difficult because most of my work is to do with writing and editing, so I can't listen to words. No. But I watch, I guess I watch like Sam Vaknin and stuff. This guy, like he gives these. Well, he also talks about psychopathy and narcissism, but he's a kind of diagnosed narcissist, a very intelligent man, Israeli guy. He'd been in prison for fraud, but he's now a professor of psychology. He does these very interesting videos that are like from the inside of these tendencies.
What's his name
pathologies. Again? Sam Vaknin, Vaknin.
Okay.
I don't know. I watched some of these before I go to bed sometimes.
Oh, okay.
He does like a video every day.
Some people are like that.
So.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I listen to a lot of music, I guess. I listen to
I'm just
NTSO.
wondering if you set aside like the John Euler conversation's 3 hours. So I'm just wondering, are you jogging? Do you have a treadmill, like one of those rowing machines?
No,
I
knitting?
Watched that
like,
what are you doing?
Course. Oh, this is like research for your show. I watched that show over the course of 2 nights.
Okay.
But with lots of pauses to think about what he was saying. Okay. I guess.
Okay. So you devoted your attention to it. You didn't need any distractions, not even Civ 5 playing in the background.
No, not at all. And I don't often play Civ 5. No. I try to like focus on whatever it is that I'm doing. I don't, I don't like the multiple distractions.
Okay.
It's like I listen to music I do listen to music and write, but they sort of play off each other maybe. But if I'm watching a YouTube video, I watch it really carefully, often with subtitles or just to like get everything.
At 0.5 speed, do you like really just slow it down and just
No,
revel in it?
no. I like the normal pitch of things. But it's like about gesture and character.
Yeah.
Interested in these things.
That's why I post the video. I think it's really important, the faces and the
I mean, you'd make a
yeah.
great psychoanalyst because you kind of compel people to speak.
Do I?
In your because you exude this kind of like I didn't even realize that conversation had started. You know what I mean? It's like you were recording, and I was like, oh, maybe I should not. I should just be like, more like I'm being recorded. But yeah, anyway, no, because you have a certain kind of gentle and open passivity, which it encourages people to speak, which is what you get with a lot of psychoanalysts. So if you wanted to retrain as a psychoanalyst.
Yeah, I think about that, but then like I don't think I'd make it going back to school at this point. I'd probably get canceled pretty quick. Because academia is academia.
I wouldn't be too like I go back and forth on this. Yeah, I think it's. But if you're doing something specialist, which is like a skill, and psychoanalysis proper is not about judgment, right? Like there's a lot of discussion about therapy, and a lot of the criticisms of therapy are really good because they're basically, of course, therapists are ideological, and some therapists are, promoting the ideas of the regime, if you like. And what works for women doesn't work for men. There's lots of discussion about this. Therapy is very feminized. It would actually be great to have more men in analysis or therapy. But ideally, the therapist is not judgmental. The analyst is certainly not judgmental in the Lacanian or Freudian sense, right? Because, you're trying to let the other person's unconscious speak. This is the agreement, if you like. Lacan says psychoanalysis is what happens when two people agree not to have sex, right? So you're in this relation, which is purely about talking and listening. And some people are better at listening than others. It's a skill, obviously.
Or a burden.
Oh, yeah. But you can weaponize your listening. Parlay it into
power, prestige, employment.
Well, your self-employment, I guess. You're employing yourself.
Yeah, at the time being, yeah. So speaking of employment, what's coming up next for you? So let's plug your products. You have various podcasts that you produce. One for...
I have some holy water. I will sell you in this glass.
Okay. Yeah. It's from the plains of Spain or something.
It's from the puddles of Wiltshire. I'm working for Compact, this great magazine. I would say subscribe to Compact if you are interested in these dialogues, these discussions between people on the serious left, I would say, the theory critical center, the conservative right, the religious, people. It's very heterodox in the best possible way. It's the kind of dialogues I wanted to have. So anyone interested in liberalism, geopolitics, culture, politics, art, blah, blah, blah. Compact is going really well. And so I'm largely working on this. I had to get my head back into having a job as well, right? Because I was basically unemployed for like 3 years. So it was like, I actually have to do things now. And,
oh, wow. You just like floated through COVID?
Yeah. I had to sell like my wires. I ran out of money. I ended up, because I left my job and then I wasn't.
Well, you sold your wires like you were pulling like metal out of your house and selling it on the black market?
Oh, not quite that
like
bad.
Some
but
sort of meth addict?
Like with electrical equipment, like you end up with all this stuff.
Yeah.
There's a shop that was open and I could sell like all my wires for like 20 quid. It was pretty bad because I was still counted as employed. So I didn't get any grants because they didn't know I was unemployed. And anyway, it was really funny, but not that funny because being really poor like erodes your soul. And I did have somewhere to live, so I was very grateful for that, right? But I had to do other stuff.
You were writing a book during this time? You were going on GBN News?
I was finishing the book. And
sparring with Piers Morgan and prime time?
I didn't, not quite.
Okay.
I wrote columns for the Telegraph about art and culture. So every time someone pulled down a statue, I became like their statue correspondent. So I wrote about 30 columns about pulling statues down, and that was my income. And I did some online teaching in this post-academic, para-academic world with Justin Murphy and these other great platforms. So MCAP and GCAS, and these actually really took off, unsurprisingly, during the lockdown, because people like in Australia who'd been locked in the middle of a desert for like 6 months were like, oh my God, I need to speak to people about something interesting. So I taught lots of courses on Illich and Girard and Bataille and angels, even got really crazy. One on risk, so on. And so that was a bit of income. But yeah, I was kind of, free. And freedom is both liberating and terrifying, as we know.
Yeah. And then you picked up, when did you start with Compact?
So like March, April this year.
Okay.
So
full-time?
We haven't been going for a year yet, but it's
okay, wow.
Yeah.
So you don't even have time for another book? Do you have another book up your sleeve or in the works?
Well, I think we even discussed this last time I was on your show, and you came up with this great idea, which I was going to steal, with a citation about Gen X, which was to do with this idea of like that maybe Gen X can mediate between millennials and boomers. And you had this lovely thought about diplomacy, and I thought this was great. So I was going to write a bigger book about Gen X, but it might be a book about the 90s. I'm not sure. It might be something about what can the world learn from Gen X, if anything. And it would obviously be really ironic and humorous and self-critical and silly.
Yeah. A little meta.
A little, yeah. But something like that. Like, what is our role? And I wrote a piece about Gen X for Compact recently, in which I looked at various stats, but also, thought about it more poetically. Who were we? Who are we? What have we done or not done?
What did you come up with?
Well, I looked at various things. I mean, I looked at the suicide rates, which unfortunately track our generation. So I'm actually kind of interested in this question of why other generations don't kill themselves at the rates that Gen X did. So the median age for suicide was like in the early 20s when Gen X were in their 20s, and now it's 40s, 50s, particularly men. I wrote about male suicide in my book.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in like why that is, why this generation, one of my interests, right? It's not all bleak, but why didn't we develop the same kind of or different protective mechanisms against forms of exit, if you like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes down to that primacy of experience that we had, and I think that it's high burnout too, and then also with men just prioritizing experience rather than building value, right?
Yeah.
Because value can be externalized, but experience, just like, and then you run out of gumption for it and you don't have anything there. So,
right. So stop. I would say, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, even though I'm talking about extreme experiences and so on, right, I don't necessarily think the decisions I've made in my life are the correct ones. In fact, I think they're not. Right. And I think that there are, as you say, forms of stability, virtue, relationality, families, tradition that are actually good for the vast majority of people and should be encouraged, because it is actually what most people want. People don't want to be screaming naked at the top of a fucking mountain. Some people might want that.
Is that where you found your taste in naturally occurring bubbly water?
Yeah, right, exactly. So, diving into springs like sulfuric, no. But, it's like those things are important for a reason, right? Those institutions, if you like, these are the good institutions, like the family, and these are the things that the left want to, the current left, fake left, want to destroy because they want to abolish everything, Why? Why do people want to abolish everything?
Antinomianism?
What is this urge? Yeah,
chaos.
What is this urge? Yeah.
Freedom.
This love of chaos. We all have it. And it's how you tame the chaos, how you come to terms with your own destructive capacity. We are infinitely capable of destruction, all of us.
Why do you write poetry?
Because it is an expression of freedom and the capacity to be free in some ways. I think I'm very interested in forms of resistance to machinic ways of being and thinking. you know, and you could do a whole show about AI and capture of linguistic capacity and so on. I think poetry, whatever we want to call that, is an attempt in some ways, or can be seen as an attempt to break the shackles of a habitual relation to language, which is not to say it's completely without bounds. In
Yeah.
fact, it is constrained as well. Nothing follows without constraint, right? Even the most free jazz is constrained, right? But it's also not for anything because it's not for money. It's not for a publication. It doesn't have any restriction. I get to put my stupid on my Substack. All my stupid photographs. I just love walking around and taking photographs. They're not very good, but it doesn't matter. I enjoy it. It's like singing in church.
Yeah.
It's the participation. It's the enjoyment in the collective, you know, love of words and sound and images in an uplifting or funny or positive way.
Yeah. Do you have a dark thing that you put into the world? Or is it all joy and analysis?
No, I think, you know, what does Nietzsche say? One is superficial out of profundity.
Huh.
No, I'm very aware of my darkness and I, you know, and other people's maybe. But like I say, it's a decision. You can make a decision to be grateful, you know, and to be hopeful and optimistic. It's possible.
I'm going to end it there. I love ending on a good note. Nina Power, amazing conversationalist. I had no idea what we were going to speak about, and
No.
we filled up the time. It's great to interact with you.
You too.
Right. And cool.